Happy New Year, and before I start this video, allow me to remind you all that I have a new channel for all of my anime content, and I started up my own comedy channel. And I'll have some announcements after I finish the timeline, and I have a family member from the same place I am who started up his own channel about Orthodox Christianity, so if you like my accent, check it out just for that. With that being said, let's get back to the video. The Roman Empire, one of the most influential countries in all of history, but it is no longer with us. If you already know why it fell, skip to the time shown on the screen. For those of you that don't, in 395 the Roman Empire split between East and West. The Eastern Empire is today referred to as the Byzantine Empire. The Western Empire fell to Germanic peoples who set up their own kingdoms where the Roman Empire was. I'll explain the fall of the Byzantine Empire later. To change the fate of the Roman Empire, I'll go back to the Emperor Constantine. He divided his empire between his three sons, Constantine II, Constans I, and Constantius II, and one of his nephews called Dalmatius in 337. My change is that Constantine in this timeline will raise his sons in such a way that they become more cautious as they get older. Due to gradually becoming a more cautious man, Constantius II would conquer Dalmatius's territory more slowly, but it would definitely be completed long before his death. Due to the three sons being more cautious, they'd managed to avoid having each other killed. However, their heirs would likely be far more daring and try to conquer each other's territories. So after the first one dies, his successor will have to deal with two cautious adversaries. But when the second one dies, the remaining son of Constantine will have to deal with two daring adversaries. The second son of Constantine would likely die in the last 7th of the 4th century. However, we won't see a complete conquest of any of these three divisions of the Roman Empire yet, considering they'd have bigger fish to fry. This was when the Germanic invasion started, and this time the Eastern Empire is almost as powerful as it was in our timeline, but the two Western empires are significantly weaker in this timeline, so they would just collapse, falling to the invaders faster, at least 50 years earlier than in our timeline. And considering that in the early 5th century in both our timeline and this timeline, any non-Romans, aka barbarians, were fiercely distrusted in the Roman government. In the 81 years between the death of the Roman Emperor Theodosius I in 395 AD and the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, the Romans grew more and more accustomed to working alongside quote-unquote barbarians, and more Christian as well. In 406 AD, most of the barbarians crossed the Rhine. And for those of you that think me using the word barbarian in its historical sense is offensive even though it just means a non-Roman, here are clips from an official documentary.
The Western Empire was overrun by barbarian tribes.
Flavius Appius was half barbarian.
These countries were controlled by local leaders and barbarian settlers.
Anyway, back to the timeline. The 410s was when most of the Germanic tribes settled in the areas they would later conquer from the Western Roman Empire. So without the generations of Romans growing up and cooperating with barbarian tribes, the barbarians would have had a much harder time in working with the Roman populace. The barbarians used pre-existing Roman bureaucracy in their kingdoms. Without all that time they had to adapt in our timeline, the Romans would have resisted the barbarians even more. Taxes would be harder to gather, manpower would be harder to organize, and revolts would be all over the place. All of that means the barbarian kingdoms would be far weaker than they were in actual history. And the Huns would get to pillage these weaker Germanic states even more, weakening them further. But after Attila dies in his 40s, they'd retreat like they did in our timeline. They were very interested in plundering, not so much conquering or settling. But if they do conquer somewhere, the populace will be even more hostile than they were to the Germanic peoples, as Huns were seen as super barbaric. Seeing this weakness, the Eastern Roman Empire would strike to the west. In our timeline, when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian took Italy, he was engaged in a long guerrilla war with the Goths and Lombards, not to mention hostilities with the Persians. For these reasons, Italy was always unprofitable for the Byzantine Empire. However, in this timeline, it would have been profitable due to Rome's sense central location in the Mediterranean and Sicily's rich deposits of sulfur, and the fact that in the 400s Persia was peaceable with the Romans and the Lombards were a long way off. The Eastern Roman Empire would probably have no problems reconquering, subjugating, and holding the Mediterranean Empire, fortified along the sturdy Danube and Alpine frontiers. And I don't think they'd just stop where Justinian did. I think they'd also conquer southern Gaul, or modern-day France, and later on conquer the kingdom of the Gepids, as they were both profitable. And somewhere along the line, the Alemanni, Thuringians, and Lombards would form a confederation like the Iroquois did, due to having a giant militaristic neighbour to the south which might try territory grabbing at any moment. And the Franks, Visigoths, Suebi, and Burgundians would Latinize faster than in our timeline to try and decrease prejudice towards them from Latinized peoples. And since the Dark Ages were brought about by the collapse of Rome, although the Dark Ages were not as dark as everyone thinks, considering inventions and innovations were going on, and we just don't have the centralized record for keeping it, with a more centralized government and less barbarians coming over to worry about, someone might have the foresight to put some of the tech they do have to different uses. The Eastern Roman Empire had coin-operated water machines, steam-powered engines, and hydraulic lifts. Yet, because of the concerns at the time, no one really thought of implementing them beyond what they were already using them for. Take out the political troubles, government collapse, etc., and see what they might invent. With a better grip on the West, the Romans could focus on solidifying their eastern borders. In our timeline, the overextensions of Justinian's conquests led the Persians to believe they could conquer the Byzantines. Without that perceived weakness, I think a sort of cold war between the Romans and Sassanids would be waged instead of a series of all-out wars. In our timeline, in the 7th century, after those empires had worn each other out with all-out wars, the early Muslims were able to take over much of the Byzantine Empire and almost all of the Sassanid Empire, with both empires being far stronger than in our timeline. In Eurasia, Islam would likely never have expanded past the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabs may or may not expand into the Horn of Africa, considering the Axumites or the people of modern-day Ethiopia would have received support from the Romans to keep them out, and the Axumites were important middlemen for their trade with India. However, this part of the world was experiencing full-on climate change. The aridity went up around the time, and the Sahara saw increased desertification, and the Ethiopian highlands became much more productive agriculturally. And since the Arabs still have Khalid bin Walid, who was one of the greatest military leaders in the world at the time, the Arabs would likely push the Sassanids out of the Arabian Peninsula. The border between the Arabs and Sassanid Empire could be anywhere in Mesopotamia, since it was usually all but impossible to defend from the south, and due to the same climate change I spoke about affecting the Horn of Africa, there would still be significant Arab settlement in Mesopotamia before Islam. I've even read some hypotheses that the initial Arab invasion of Persian territory was just continuing the policy of uniting all Arabs. After this, they'd conquer the parts of the Byzantine Empire in modern-day southern Jordan and Saudi Arabia, but no further. In our timeline, the early Muslims conquered all of this territory. Since they conquered scholars from far and wide, they ended up causing a brief renaissance centered around Baghdad. Without that in this timeline, the scientific advancements I mentioned, thanks to the Roman Empire surviving, science may not actually be more advanced in this timeline than our timeline, but it would definitely be different. And the various civilizations of the Sahel that converted to Islam in our timeline, like the Ghana or Kanem empires, would likely convert to some sort of Christianity or an offshoot of Christianity instead. Moving on to the parts of Asia that converted to Islam, there is a misconception that one has to be Persian to be Zoroastrian. In actuality, Zoroastrianism, the state religion of Persia at the time, developed in eastern Iran, outside of Persia. The religion just didn't look favorably on converts for at least 3 generations. In Zoroastrianism, fire is seen as pure, and some Zoroastrians in the 6th or 7th century century saw smithing and glassmaking as defiling fire, even though the fire is altering the glass and metals, not the other way around. If Zoroastrians persist in this timeline that those skills are defiling fire, then smiths, glassmakers, and other people with such skills would start converting to Christianity, Islam, or Manichaeanism. And with the growing presence of these religions, Zoroastrianism would be due a conservative backlash and period of attempting to convert everyone. But by the Sassanid period, there was an understanding that only Iranic peoples could be Zoroastrian, so places like Mesopotamia and India were not expected to convert. But Christian and Buddhist influences were seen as a threat to Iranic orthodoxy, so they were persecuted even in places where the traditional local religion was accepted, and perceived Zoroastrian heresies like Manichaeanism were almost always suppressed. When it comes to the effects of the lack of wars against the Romans, the Sassanids were less conquest-based than the Romans were, so we wouldn't see more land battles against Indian states, but they were uniquely situated in the middle of all of Rome's long-distance trade. Controlling the Red Sea via southern Arabia would be especially valuable, just as it was in real life, and more naval presence in the Indian Ocean would limit direct Roman trade with India, so we'd see the Persians in more naval battles there. Another thing is that if the Sassanids weren't fighting in the west, they'd most likely be fighting in the east, where the other major trade route of the Roman Empire was the Silk Road, where the eastern end of the same steppe migrations that pressured the Germanic invasions sent Turkic groups like the Kushans and Hephthalites into Persian territory. A conservative Zoroastrian revival movement may have even supported that. They were out of Sassanid control, but they practiced a slightly different form of Zoroastrianism outside of the Sassanid priesthood's control, which was also a driving motivation in the early Sassanid-Roman conflicts in the Caucasus. Since the Romans would have done much better, they would have relied a lot less on foederati, so expect a lot less Bulgar, Magyar, and Avar influence in the Balkans, or this area the Romans would rule as a whole. Then everything would change when the the Vikings would attack, so they would have more land available to use foederati to decrease and fight off Viking raids, so expect a lot more Nordic influence near the Mediterranean. But considering we know far less about the history of Serbo-Croats at this time, I don't know if there'd be any more or less of them in this region, so I'm going to make the boring statement that they would migrate to the Balkans at similar numbers to our timeline. Whether the Schism of 1054 happens or not depends on if you believe the Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Catholic Church government is what was used before the schism, which I won't get into in this video since I don't want to lose subscribers. When it comes to the Mongols, it's hard to say whether or not they would even develop if the Sassanids continued to influence Central Asia, assuming a powerful Mongol Empire or another Turkic Khaganate still emerges in the 13th century near China. Its success would largely depend on the Persian position in Central Asia at the time. If they expand further north, encompassing something similar to their existing borders and the northern parts of what was in our timeline the Khwarezmian Empire, then it's plausible that the Mongols would be just as successful in Iran as they were in our timeline. If there is a separate Central Asian power in modern Turkmenistan, then there would still be a chance for the Persians to hold the Mongols back at the Kopet Dag Mountains. The Byzantine Empire breathed its last breath in 1453. Its heartland surrounded the geographic center of all landmass on Earth, so it was worn down with wars against enemies from all sides before its capital was eventually conquered by the Ottoman Empire, which wouldn't exist in this timeline since their Turkic ancestors never would have made it to the Anatolian plateau, since the Roman Empire would be so much more powerful at the time. Before the Ottomans conquered the last of the Byzantine Empire, the rest of Europe bought Asian goods, especially spices from the Byzantines. The hostility of the Ottomans towards the West caused them to look for a new route to buy Asian goods, which led to the discovery of the Americas. With that delayed along with all the other changes I've mentioned, the rest of history is butterflied. But what I can say is the cultures and languages of the Iberian Peninsula and Italy would have far less Arab and possibly Berber influence, and the cultures and languages of not just the previously mentioned areas but also France and the Benelux countries would have far less Germanic influence. Thank you all so much for watching, and now that the timeline is over, here are my announcements. I'm going to make more videos on actual history, seeing that I have a whole playlist of alternate history videos where I made embarrassing mistakes. There there are lots of areas in history I'm not as well versed in, and alternate history involves a lot of variables, so I'll need help. And trust me when I say this, there's something that each of you could do to help me. Just comment if you're willing to, if you want me to keep making more alternate history videos. And another thing is, I might stream on Twitch playing this game and pointing out anything it may have gotten historically inaccurate someday. Anyway, peace out my homies.